Jack Harrison's heart pounded as he stared at the massive white horse collapsed in the blood-stained snow, its leg twisted at an impossible angle, and its eyes pleading for either mercy or salvation. In that frozen moment between life and death, the veteran made a decision that would defy all logic but ultimately save them both. Before we continue, don't forget to subscribe to the channel, like the video, and comment where in the world you're watching from. Let's go. The silence of the snow-covered forest was broken only by the crunch of Jack Harrison's boots as he made his way through the pristine landscape. The tall pines stood like sentinels, their branches heavy with winter's burden, watching over the man who moved with purpose despite the limp in his gait. Jack pulled his worn military jacket tighter around his broad shoulders, his breath forming clouds in the frigid mountain air. 3 years had passed since he'd returned from his final tour in Afghanistan, but the wilderness remained the only place where the echoes of war seemed to fade into something bearable. Jack's beard, now flecked with gray despite his 35 years, collected tiny crystals of ice as he trekked deeper into the backcountry. This monthly expedition into the mountains had become his ritual, a necessary escape from the well-meaning but suffocating concern of friends and family who couldn't understand why he chose solitude over their company. They didn't know that the quiet of the forest was the only therapy that worked for him, the only place where the hypervigilance that kept him alive overseas could finally ease its grip. He adjusted the pack on his shoulders, the familiar weight of survival gear a comfort rather than a burden. His cabin was still a good 3 miles ahead, nestled in a clearing that overlooked a valley few people ever visited. Jack had purchased the property with his combat pay, seeking a sanctuary where the nightmares might finally release him from their hold. Some nights were better than others, but the isolation helped. Here, no one flinched when he woke up shouting. No one walked on eggshells around him, afraid to say the wrong thing or ask the wrong question. The late afternoon sun cast long shadows across the snow as Jack paused to consult his compass, though he hardly needed it anymore. His training had made him methodical, and 3 years of these journeys had made the path familiar. Still, habits formed in combat died hard, if they died at all. He took a swig from his canteen, the cold water a shock to his system that brought his senses into sharper focus. That's when he heard it. A sound so faint that anyone else might have missed it. A soft, labored breathing that didn't belong to any of the usual forest inhabitants Jack had come to recognize. His body tensed instinctively, old reflexes kicking in as he scanned his surroundings. Nothing moved among the trees, but the sound continued, pulling him off his planned route toward a small clearing ahead. What Jack saw as he pushed through the final stand of pines made him stop in his tracks. There, lying in the snow like a fallen angel, was the largest horse he'd ever encountered. Its coat was pure white, nearly blending with the snow around it, but Jack could see the powerful muscles beneath, now trembling with exhaustion or cold or both. This was no ordinary horse. It was massive, wild, and magnificent, even in its current state, and it was dying. Jack approached slowly, careful not to startle the animal. Its eyes, dark pools against the white of its coat, tracked his movement with a mixture of fear and resignation. As he drew closer, Jack could see the problem. The horse's leg was twisted at an unnatural angle, likely broken in a fall. Blood had frozen in crimson patches on the pristine snow, and the creature's breathing was shallow and irregular. "Easy there, big guy," Jack murmured, his voice rusty from disuse. He set his pack down and crouched a few feet away, giving the horse time to accept his presence. "What happened to you, huh?" The horse made no attempt to rise, which told Jack everything he needed to know about how long it had been suffering here. Days, perhaps, surviving on snow for water, unable to reach food, waiting for the inevitable end that came to all wounded creatures in the wilderness. Something in the animal's quiet dignity struck a chord in Jack. How many times had he lain awake, wishing for an end to his own suffering? How many times had he felt just as trapped, just as helpless as this magnificent creature before him. Slowly, Jack removed his gloves and extended his hand, palm up. "I'm not going to hurt you," he promised, though he knew the horse couldn't understand his words. But perhaps it could understand his intent, carried in the tone of his voice and the steadiness of his movements. To his surprise, the horse didn't pull away. Instead, after a moment of hesitation, it stretched its neck slightly, nostrils flaring as it caught his scent. Jack remained perfectly still, letting the animal decide if he was friend or foe. Finally, the horse's muzzle touched his palm, the contact so gentle it might have been imagined if not for the warmth Jack felt against his cold skin. "That's it," he encouraged, moving his hand slowly to stroke the horse's neck. "I've got you now." The logical part of Jack's mind knew what needed to be done. A wild horse with a broken leg, miles from any road in the dead of winter. Mercy would be a bullet. He even had his sidearm in his pack, carried out of habit more than necessity. One shot would end the animal's suffering cleanly and quickly. But as he looked into those intelligent eyes, Jack found he couldn't do it. Perhaps it was selfish, perhaps it was foolish, but in that moment, he made a decision that defied all logic and practical consideration. "I'm going to help you," he told the horse firmly, as if speaking the words aloud would make the impossible task ahead somehow achievable. "But you're going to have to trust me." Jack stood and surveyed the situation with a tactician's eye. The cabin was too far to move the horse in its current condition. He would need to make camp here, tend to the animal's immediate needs, and figure out a more permanent solution. Fortunately, he had enough supplies for a few days, and his training had prepared him for unexpected situations, if not exactly this one. Working efficiently despite the cold that numbed his fingers, Jack set up a makeshift camp near the horse. He gathered branches and built a small fire, creating a pocket of warmth in the frozen landscape. Next, he cleared snow from around the horse and laid down the emergency blanket from his pack, providing some insulation from the cold ground. The sun was setting rapidly now, painting the snow in hues of pink and gold. Jack knew the temperature would drop dangerously after dark. He needed to examine the horse's injury before the light failed completely. "This might hurt," he warned as he knelt beside the injured leg, "but I need to see what we're dealing with." The horse tensed as Jack's hands gently probed the swollen area, but it didn't lash out. Whether from weakness or some innate understanding that Jack was trying to help, the animal remained remarkably calm. The leg was definitely broken, but Jack couldn't tell how badly without proper light and equipment. As darkness fell, Jack finished setting up his small tent and gathered more wood for the fire. He melted snow in his cooking pot, and after it cooled slightly, brought it to the horse's mouth. The animal drank eagerly, confirming Jack's suspicion that dehydration was a serious concern. "Tomorrow we'll figure this out," Jack promised as he settled beside the horse, sharing his body heat through the long, cold night ahead. "Just hang on until then." Under the vast canopy of stars, man and horse formed an unlikely alliance against the wilderness that sought to claim them both. And for the first time in longer than he could remember, Jack Harrison felt a purpose beyond mere survival. Whether it was wise or foolish, he had made a commitment to this magnificent creature. He would see it through, whatever it took. Dawn broke with painful slowness, the light creeping hesitantly across the snow, as if afraid to reveal what the night had concealed. Jack opened his eyes, momentarily disoriented until the weight against his side reminded him, the horse, the injury, his impulsive decision. He had dozed fitfully through the night, waking at every sound and movement, both to tend the fire and to check on his new charge. Surprisingly, the massive animal had survived the night, its breathing more regular than it had been the previous evening. "Morning," Jack said softly, his voice carrying in the still air. The horse's ear twitched at the sound, and its dark eye opened to regard him with what Jack could almost believe was recognition. "Let's get you some water." His muscles protested as he rose, stiff from the cold and the awkward position he'd maintained to share warmth with the horse. Military life had taught Jack to ignore physical discomfort, to push through regardless of circumstance. The leg that had earned him an honorable discharge and a Purple Heart ached fiercely in the cold, but he moved with practiced efficiency, melting snow and bringing it to the horse just as he had done through the night. As the horse drank, Jack assessed their situation with growing concern. He couldn't leave the animal here to die, but he also couldn't stay indefinitely. His supplies would last 3 days at most, and that was if he ate sparingly. The horse needed food too, and medical attention beyond what he could provide with the basic first aid kit in his pack. "We need a plan, big fellow," Jack murmured, running his hand along the horse's powerful neck. The animal's coat was rough with dried sweat and dirt, but Jack could feel the strength beneath, the life force that refused to surrender despite overwhelming odds. It reminded him of men he'd served with, the ones who'd held on through impossible situations, who'd refused to die even when their bodies were broken beyond repair. Jack's thoughts turned to Mike Townsend, the only veterinarian in the small town 30 miles from his cabin. Mike had served too, though in a different unit and a different war. He understood the silence that sometimes fell over Jack, the 1,000-yard stare that appeared without warning. More importantly, he knew horses, having grown up on a ranch before joining the military and later attending vet school on the GI Bill. But Mike was a 3-day hike away under normal conditions. With a wounded horse and deteriorating weather, Jack glanced at the heavy clouds gathering on the horizon. It might as well be 1,000 miles. "Looks like a storm coming," Jack told the horse as if the animal could understand the implications. "We need shelter. Something better than my tent." Scanning the area, Jack spotted a rock outcropping about 50 yards away. It wasn't ideal, but it might provide some protection from the wind and snow. The real question was whether he could move the horse that far with its broken leg. Jack knew what any rational person would do in this situation, what any of his former commanders would order. Logistically, trying to save this horse was a fool's errand. But something in those eyes, something in the quiet dignity with which the animal bore its pain, made the rational choice impossible for Jack to accept. "All right," he decided, speaking more to himself than to the horse. "Let's get you up." Jack gathered branches from nearby trees, stripping them of smaller offshoots to create makeshift splints. Using rope from his pack, he fashioned a crude but functional brace for the horse's broken leg. It wouldn't heal the break, but it might provide enough support for the short journey to better shelter. "This is going to hurt," he warned as he carefully positioned the splints around the horse's leg. The animal tensed but remained surprisingly cooperative, as if understanding Jack's intentions. When he tightened the rope to secure the splints, the horse let out a pained sound that cut through Jack like a knife, but it didn't struggle or try to pull away. Once the splint was in place, Jack faced the daunting task of getting the massive animal to its feet. He'd helped wounded comrades before, had carried men twice his size across dangerous terrain, but a horse of this size was another matter entirely. "On 3, Jack said, positioning himself to support as much of the horse's weight as possible. 1, 2, 3. He strained against the animal's bulk, muscles burning with the effort. For a heart-stopping moment, nothing happened. Then, with a tremendous effort, the horse began to rise. Its legs trembled violently, and Jack feared they would buckle, but somehow the animal found the strength to stand. The injured leg barely touched the ground, the horse instinctively keeping its weight off the broken limb. "Good job," Jack praised, breathing hard from exertion. "That's it. Just lean on me." And the horse did, its massive body pressing against Jack's side as they began the painstaking journey toward the rock outcropping. Each step was a battle, the horse moving awkwardly on three legs while Jack supported as much weight as his human frame could bear. The distance seemed to stretch impossibly, 50 yards becoming 50 miles in Jack's perception. When they finally reached the shelter of the rocks, both man and horse were exhausted. Jack carefully helped the animal lower itself to the ground, then immediately began gathering materials to create a windbreak and expand their shelter. He worked tirelessly, ignoring his own fatigue, driven by the knowledge that the approaching storm could mean death if they weren't adequately protected. By midday, Jack had constructed a reasonably effective shelter using his tarp, branches, and snow packed to form walls. The space was tight, but it would retain heat better than his tent alone. The fire he built just outside the entrance provided additional warmth that reflected off the rock face behind them. As the first snowflakes began to fall, Jack turned his attention to the horse's injury. With better light and the animal no longer lying in deep snow, he could assess the damage more accurately. The break was clean from what he could tell, a simple fracture rather than the compound break he had feared. With proper care it might heal, though the horse would likely always have a limp. "You're lucky," Jack told the animal as he adjusted the splint to provide better support. "Could have been much worse." The horse nickered softly in response, its breath warm against Jack's cheek as he worked. The sound stirred something in Jack's memory. Summer days at his grandfather's farm, the smell of hay and leather, the simple joy he'd found in the company of animals before life had taken him in a different direction. As the snow began to fall more heavily, Jack settled beside the horse once more, sharing his emergency blanket and body heat. The storm moved in faster than he'd anticipated, the wind howling around their shelter like a living thing hunting for entry. But within their small sanctuary, man and horse remained dry and relatively warm, united in their struggle against the elements. "We'll get through this," Jack promised, though he wasn't entirely sure how. One problem at a time, he reminded himself. Survive the storm, then worry about getting help. The horse's breathing had steadied, its massive head now resting trustingly against Jack's shoulder. Despite everything, the cold, the uncertainty, the pain in his bad leg, Jack felt a sense of peace he hadn't experienced in years. Here, in this moment, his purpose was clear. Keep this animal alive. No politics, no moral ambiguities, no haunting questions about whether his actions had truly served a greater good. Just simple survival. Just life persisting against the odds. The storm descended upon them with unexpected ferocity, transforming the serene winter landscape into a howling maelstrom of wind and snow. Inside their makeshift shelter, Jack listened to the tempest's rage, grateful for the solid rock at their backs and the crude windbreak he'd constructed. The horse's massive body generated considerable heat in the confined space, a blessing Jack hadn't anticipated when he'd made his impulsive decision to help the animal. "Sounds like we made the right call getting to cover," Jack said, his words creating small clouds in the frigid air. The horse's ear flicked in his direction, a small acknowledgement that Jack found oddly comforting. He'd spent too many months talking to himself in his isolated cabin. Even one-sided conversation felt like a welcome change. As the day progressed, the storm showed no signs of abating. Jack rationed his supplies carefully, melting snow for water and sharing his limited food with the horse. He'd packed jerky, energy bars, and dried fruit for himself, hardly a feast but enough to sustain him. For the horse, he offered handfuls of oats he'd brought for his morning meals, supplemented with bark and branches he'd stripped from nearby pines before the storm made venturing outside impossible. "Not exactly gourmet," Jack apologized as the horse lipped the offerings from his palm, "but it'll keep you going until I can find something better." The confined quarters forced an intimacy that would have made Jack uncomfortable under different circumstances. He'd grown accustomed to solitude, to the vast emptiness of his mountain retreat where memories couldn't corner him. But here, pressed against the warm flank of this wild creature, Jack found himself thinking of his grandfather's farm again, of the horses he'd known as a boy, Prince and Lady, the gentle draft horses that had pulled the plow and wagon and taught a young Jack the meaning of trust and responsibility. "Had a horse once," Jack found himself saying, his voice barely audible above the wind. "Not mine exactly, my grandfather's. A big bay gelding named Samson." He stroked the white horse's neck absently as he spoke, the rhythmic motion soothing them both. "Strong, like you, stubborn too." The memory came back with surprising clarity. Samson refusing to cross a wooden bridge, planting his hooves firmly despite all of 12-year-old Jack's urgent pleas. Later, they discovered the bridge had been weakened by spring floods and would have collapsed under their weight. Somehow the horse had known. "Saved my life," Jack continued. "Not that I understood it at the time, just thought he was being difficult." The white horse shifted slightly, adjusting its position to take pressure off the injured leg. Jack helped, supporting the animal's weight as much as he could during the movement. When they settled again, the horse's head came to rest against Jack's shoulder, the gesture so trusting it made his throat tighten unexpectedly. Night fell early, the darkness absolute beyond the small circle of light from their fire. Jack fed the flames carefully, conscious of their dwindling wood supply. If the storm lasted much longer, he would need to venture out to gather more despite the danger. Sleep came in fits and starts, Jack's military training keeping him alert to changes in their environment even as exhaustion pulled at him. Sometime in the darkest hours, he jerked awake to find the horse watching him, its eyes reflecting the dying firelight. "Bad dreams," Jack explained unnecessarily, his heart still racing from the fragments of memory that had pursued him into sleep. The explosion, the screams of his men, the weight of responsibility pressing down on him like a physical thing. They come with the territory. The horse continued to regard him steadily, without judgment or expectation. There was something almost therapeutic about that gaze. No pity, no awkward attempts to understand what couldn't be understood by anyone who hadn't been there. Just simple presence, anchoring Jack to the moment rather than the past. By morning, the storm had reduced to a steady snowfall, the wind no longer threatening to tear away their shelter. Jack made his way outside, sinking knee-deep in fresh powder. The world had been transformed overnight, familiar landmarks buried beneath smooth white drifts. Navigation would be challenging, but at least the reduced visibility wouldn't be as life-threatening as it would have been during the height of the storm. Jack spent an hour gathering wood, breaking trail through the deep snow with each step. His bad leg protested the exertion, but he pushed through the pain with the discipline of a man accustomed to physical hardship. When he returned to the shelter, arms laden with branches, the horse nickered in greeting, the sound unexpectedly welcome after the silence of the snow-muffled forest. "Missed me, did you?" Jack asked, a hint of a smile tugging at his lips for the first time in what felt like ages. "Or just hoping I brought breakfast?" After building up the fire and ensuring they had water, Jack turned his attention to the horse's leg. The splint had held through the night, but the area around the break was swollen and warm to the touch, signs of inflammation that concerned him. Infection was a risk, especially out here where his ability to treat it was limited. "Need to clean this," he muttered, rummaging through his first aid kit. He found antiseptic wipes, antibiotic ointment, and clean bandages, basic supplies intended for human injuries but better than nothing. With gentle hands, Jack cleaned the area as best he could, apologizing softly when the horse flinched at his touch. The makeshift treatment complete, Jack sat back and assessed their situation. The storm had cost them a full day, and his supplies were diminishing faster than planned. They couldn't stay here indefinitely, but moving the horse any significant distance seemed equally impossible. He needed a new plan. Jack's thoughts returned to Mike Townsend, the veterinarian. If he could reach his cabin, he could use the satellite phone there to call for help. but that would mean leaving the horse alone for at least a day, maybe longer given the fresh snow. After coming this far, the idea of abandoning the animal, even temporarily, felt wrong. "What do you think?" Jack asked the horse, not expecting an answer, but finding comfort in voicing his thoughts aloud. "Think you can make it to my cabin? It's about 3 miles from here. Rough terrain. But if we take it slow..." The horse's ears pricked forward at the sound of Jack's voice, its dark eyes fixed on him with what he could almost believe was understanding. After a moment, the animal shifted, attempting to rise despite its injury. Jack moved quickly to help, supporting the horse's weight as it struggled to its feet. "Whoa, easy," Jack cautioned, though he couldn't help but admire the creature's determination. "I didn't mean right this second. We need to plan this out." But as the horse stood before him, trembling slightly but upright, Jack felt a surge of hope. If the animal had this much fight left in it, maybe reaching the cabin wasn't such an impossible goal after all. It would be a brutal journey, especially for a horse with a broken leg, but the alternative was a slow death here in the wilderness. "All right," Jack decided, patting the horse's neck. "We'll rest today, build up your strength. Tomorrow, we try for the cabin." As if in agreement, the horse leaned slightly against him, the pressure a silent acknowledgement of their partnership. Jack found himself wondering about the animal's history, where it had come from, how it had survived in these mountains, what had brought it to that clearing where fate had intervened in the form of a solitary hiker, with his own wounds to bear. Some questions might never be answered, but one thing was becoming increasingly clear to Jack Harrison. Saving this horse had somehow become about saving himself as well. Each had something the other needed, though neither could have articulated exactly what that something was. Dawn broke clear and cold, the storm having swept through the mountains to leave behind a pristine landscape transformed by fresh snow. Jack stood outside their shelter, studying the terrain that lay between them and his cabin. 3 miles would be nothing under normal circumstances, an hour's easy hike at most. But with a wounded horse in tow and snow that reached past his knees in places, those 3 miles might as well have been 30. "Going to be a long day," Jack told the horse as he returned to their shelter. The animal was already awake, watching him with those intelligent eyes that seemed to understand more than any horse should. "But we can't stay here." Jack had spent the previous evening preparing for their journey, strengthening the splint on the horse's leg and devising a way to distribute weight more evenly. Using branches and rope, he'd fashioned a crude travois, a triangular frame that would trail behind them, offering occasional support for the horse's injured leg when the terrain allowed. "Not exactly state-of-the-art veterinary equipment," Jack admitted as he secured the contraption, "but it's the best I can do with what we've got." He packed his remaining supplies efficiently, leaving nothing behind that might be useful. The cold had deepened overnight, and Jack knew the temperature would be their enemy as much as the terrain. Cold slowed healing, sapped energy, and clouded judgment, all things they couldn't afford. "Ready?" Jack asked, helping the horse to its feet. The animal rose with less difficulty than the day before, though Jack could see the pain in its eyes, a silent acknowledgement of what lay ahead. "Just follow my trail. I'll break the path." And so they began their slow journey through the snow-laden forest. Jack moved ahead, using his body to carve a path through the deepest drifts, each step a deliberate battle against the resistance of packed snow. The horse followed, placing its hooves carefully in Jack's footprints, the injured leg barely touching the ground. The going was painfully slow. What should have taken an hour stretched into 2, then 3, with frequent stops to rest the horse and check its injury. The improvised travois worked better than Jack had dared hope, providing support when needed, though he could see the horse was still bearing most of its weight on 3 legs. "You're doing great," Jack encouraged during one of their rest breaks, offering the last handful of oats from his pack. The horse's coat was dark with sweat despite the cold, its breathing labored. Jack checked the splint again, relieved to find no signs that the injury had worsened during their trek. As they continued, Jack found himself talking more, his voice breaking the silence of the winter forest. He told the horse about his cabin, about the valley it overlooked and the stream that ran nearby, frozen now but teeming with trout in the summer. He described the simple life he'd built for himself after returning from Afghanistan, how he'd learned to live with less, to find peace in the rhythms of nature rather than the chaos of civilization. "Wasn't always like this," Jack admitted as they navigated a particularly challenging section of terrain, a fallen tree forcing them to detour through deeper snow. "When I first got back, I couldn't sleep, couldn't be around people. Everything was too loud, too bright, too much." He paused, looking back at the horse struggling behind him. "Doctors had a lot of names for it. PTSD, anxiety disorder, depression. Gave me pills that made everything fuzzy around the edges but didn't fix what was broken." The horse nickered softly, the sound almost like a question in the quiet forest. "What was broken?" Jack repeated as if the horse had indeed asked. "Hell, I don't even know. Something inside, something that used to know how to be around other people without feeling like you're watching them from the wrong end of a telescope." He shook his head, surprised at how easily the words came when his only listener was an animal that couldn't possibly understand. "That's why I came up here. Needed the space to figure it out." By midday, they had covered less than half the distance to the cabin. Jack's leg was throbbing, a constant reminder of his own wounds, both visible and invisible. The horse, too, was showing signs of fatigue, its movements becoming increasingly labored. When they stopped for another rest, Jack shared the last of his jerky with the animal, knowing they both needed the energy to continue. "We're going to make it," Jack assured the horse, though doubt had begun to creep into his thoughts. The day was advancing, and with it came the realization that they might not reach the cabin before nightfall. Being caught in the open after dark, with temperatures plummeting and no proper shelter, would be dangerous for both of them. As they pressed on, Jack found himself thinking of his team in Afghanistan: Moore, Rodriguez, Patel, Washington, men who had trusted him to lead them through hostile territory, to make decisions that would keep them alive. He had failed them that day, had watched helplessly as the IED tore through their Humvee, had carried Washington's broken body to the extraction point only to have him die in the helicopter. "Never should have taken that route," Jack muttered, the old guilt rising like bile in his throat. "Knew it wasn't cleared properly. Should have trusted my gut." The horse stumbled suddenly, nearly falling as its injured leg gave way beneath it. Jack reacted instinctively, throwing his weight against the animal's shoulder to help it regain balance. For a moment they stood pressed together, the horse trembling with exertion, Jack's arms wrapped around its neck in a gesture that was half support, half embrace. "Easy, easy," Jack soothed, his heart pounding from the near disaster. "I've got you. We're okay." But they weren't okay, and Jack knew it. The horse was reaching the limits of its endurance, and they still had at least a mile to go. The sun was already beginning its descent toward the western peaks, the shadows lengthening across the snow. Jack considered their options, none of them good. They could push on and risk the horse collapsing, or they could stop and try to create another shelter, using up precious energy they might need for the final push to the cabin. The decision was made for him when they crested a small rise and Jack spotted a familiar landmark, a distinctive rock formation that marked the boundary of his property. The cabin was still out of sight, but they were closer than he had realized. A surge of hope gave him renewed energy. "Look," he told the horse, pointing ahead, though he knew the gesture meant nothing to the animal. "We're almost there. My land starts here, just a little further." The horse lifted its head, nostrils flaring as if catching a scent on the wind. Something in its posture changed, a new determination evident in the set of its shoulders. Whether it somehow understood Jack's words or simply sensed his change in mood, the animal seemed to find a second wind, moving forward with fresh purpose despite its exhaustion. "That's it," Jack encouraged, breaking trail once more. "Just follow me. We're going home." The last half-mile to the cabin seemed eternal. Twilight was descending rapidly, the forest darkening around them as the sun slipped behind the mountains. Jack's entire body ached from breaking trail through the snow, his bad legs sending sharp protests with each step. Behind him, the horse moved with the determined resignation of a creature that had accepted pain as the price of survival. When the cabin finally came into view, Jack felt a surge of relief so powerful it nearly buckled his knees. The simple structure stood just as he had left it, a sturdy testament to his own handiwork, its roof now bearing the weight of fresh snow. Smoke still rose faintly from the chimney. The banked fire he'd left had survived his absence, a small miracle that meant warmth awaited them inside. "There it is," Jack said, turning to the horse. "Home." The animal lifted its head, nostrils flaring as it caught the scent of wood smoke on the air. Its ears pricked forward, sensing the change in their circumstances, even if it couldn't understand the significance of the structure before them. Jack had built the cabin himself, a project that had consumed his first year in the mountains. It wasn't large, a main room with a small kitchen area, a wood stove for heat, a bedroom just big enough for a single bed, and a covered porch that wrapped around two sides. It was designed for one person, certainly not for sharing with a horse the size of a small draft horse. But right now, it represented salvation. The problem, Jack realized as they approached, was how to shelter the horse. The animal was far too large to bring inside, and leaving it exposed to the elements after their arduous journey wasn't an option. His eyes fell on the tool shed attached to the side of the cabin, not insulated like the main structure, but solidly built and sheltered from the wind. It might work if he could clear enough space. "Just a little further," Jack encouraged, leading the way through the final stretch of snow to the cabin's front porch. The horse followed, its breathing labored but steady, driven by what Jack could only describe as sheer determination. By the time they reached the porch, darkness had nearly fallen. Jack helped the horse to a spot where the overhang provided some shelter from the cold, then hurried to unlock the cabin door. Inside, the air was stale but blessedly warm, the banked coals in the wood stove glowing a dull red. Jack quickly added kindling and small logs, bringing the fire back to life. With light and warmth secured, he returned to the horse, which had remained exactly where he'd left it, too exhausted to move. "Let's get you settled," Jack said, examining the tool shed with a critical eye. It was packed with equipment, his chainsaw, axe, shovel, and other implements he used to maintain the property, but if he rearranged things, there would be enough room for the horse to lie down. Working as quickly as his tired body would allow, Jack cleared the shed, moving tools to the cabin's main room. He spread old blankets on the wooden floor, creating a makeshift bed that would provide some insulation from the cold. Finally, he led the horse to the shed's entrance. "It's not much," he admitted, "but it'll keep you out of the wind and snow." The horse hesitated at the threshold, its nostrils flaring as it took in the unfamiliar smells of oil, metal, and wood. Then, with a trust that touched something deep inside Jack, it followed him into the small space. Jack helped the animal lower itself onto the blankets, relieved to see it could lie down relatively comfortably despite the confined quarters. "Rest now," Jack said, running his hand along the horse's neck. "I'll be right back." Inside the cabin, Jack moved with the efficiency of a man accustomed to looking after his own needs. He stoked the fire higher, filled a large pot with snow to melt for water, and took inventory of his supplies. There was enough food to last him a week or more, canned goods, rice, beans, some dried meat, but nothing particularly suitable for a horse. Tomorrow, he would need to figure out a more permanent solution for feeding his unexpected guest. Jack found his satellite phone and turned it on, relieved to see it had enough battery life for a call. He dialed Mike Townsend's number, hoping the veterinarian would pick up despite the late hour. "Hello?" Mike's voice came through after several rings, tinny but clear enough. "Mike, it's Jack Harrison." "Jack? Everything okay? You never call." Jack gave a short, humorless laugh. "Found myself with an unusual situation. Rescued a horse in the backcountry, big white stallion with a broken leg. Got him to my cabin, but he needs proper veterinary care." There was a moment of silence on the line. "A wild horse up in your area?" "Yeah, surprised me too. Never seen anything like him around here before." "And you managed to get him back to your place with a broken leg?" Mike sounded impressed. "That's something else, Jack." "Can you help?" Jack asked, cutting to the chase. "I've splinted the leg, but I'm no vet." Mike sighed. "Roads are a mess after that storm. County hasn't plowed the mountain routes yet. Earliest I could get up there would be day after tomorrow, assuming they clear the roads by then." Jack felt a pang of disappointment but pushed it aside. 2 days wasn't ideal, but at least the horse was sheltered now. "Anything I should be doing in the meantime?" "Keep the leg immobilized, make sure he stays hydrated, and watch for signs of infection. Heat, swelling, discharge. Got any antibiotics up there?" "Just the basic first aid stuff." "Okay, I'll bring everything when I come." "You sure you're up for this, Jack? Wild horses aren't exactly easy patients, especially injured ones." Jack glanced toward the shed where the horse rested. "We've come to an understanding." After ending the call, Jack filled a bucket with the now melted snow water and brought it to the shed. The horse was awake, but still, its eyes reflecting the beam of Jack's flashlight. It drank deeply when he offered the water, then accepted the handful of rolled oats Jack had found in his pantry. Not much, but better than nothing. Satisfied that the horse was as comfortable as possible for the moment, Jack returned to the cabin to tend to his own needs. He stripped off his wet outer layers, hung them by the fire to dry, and heated a can of beef stew on the wood stove. As he ate, the events of the past 2 days caught up with him all at once, exhaustion settling into his bones like a physical weight. Jack's thoughts drifted to the journey they'd just completed, the sheer improbability of their success. By all rights, the horse should have died in that clearing where he'd found it. By all rights, Jack should have been sensible enough to put it out of its misery rather than attempt the impossible. And yet, here they were. "Stubborn," Jack murmured to himself, uncertain whether he meant the horse or himself. Perhaps both. After finishing his meal, Jack checked on the horse one last time before turning in. The animal was sleeping now, its massive chest rising and falling in the rhythm of deep rest. Jack stood watching for a moment, struck by the strange turn his solitary existence had taken. For 3 years, he had carefully constructed a life that required no one else, that insulated him from the complications of human connection. Now, in the span of 2 days, he had allowed himself to care about another living creature, to take responsibility for its survival. The realization was both terrifying and somehow liberating. As Jack made his way to his bed, his body aching for rest, he wondered what tomorrow would bring. Mike wouldn't arrive for at least 2 days. Until then, it was just Jack and the horse, united by circumstance and something else Jack wasn't quite ready to name, something that felt uncomfortably like purpose. Jack woke before dawn, momentarily confused by the urgency he felt until memory returned. The horse, the rescue, the shed. He dressed quickly, ignoring the protests of his still aching muscles, and stepped outside into the brittle cold of early morning. The sky was beginning to lighten, stars fading as deep blue replaced the black of night. His breath formed clouds in the frigid air as he made his way to the shed. The horse was awake, its dark eyes finding Jack's the moment he entered. It made no attempt to rise, but Jack could see the alertness in its gaze, the awareness of its surroundings that spoke of strength rather than surrender. "Morning," Jack said, crouching beside the animal to check its splinted leg. The swelling hadn't increased overnight, which he took as a good sign. The horse remained still during his examination, only the occasional flick of an ear or twitch of muscle indicating any discomfort. "Mike can't get here until tomorrow at the earliest. Roads are still blocked from the storm, so it's just you and me for now." The immediate problem was food. Horses ate constantly in the wild, and this one had been subsisting on meager offerings for days now. Jack had explored his pantry the night before, taking inventory of anything that might serve as equine nutrition. He had oats, as he'd already discovered, along with some apples that were past their prime but still edible. It wasn't nearly enough. After ensuring the horse had fresh water, Jack returned to the cabin to prepare for the day ahead. He had an idea, though it would require leaving the horse alone for a few hours, something he was reluctant to do after all they'd been through to get here. "Got to find you something proper to eat," Jack explained when he returned to the shed with the bucket of water and the last of his oats. "There's a meadow about a mile from here where I've seen grass growing through the snow in protected spots. Not much, but better than nothing." The horse seemed to understand, or at least it didn't object when Jack prepared to leave, promising to return as quickly as possible. Before setting out, Jack made sure the shed door was secure but not latched. If something happened, he wanted the horse to have a way out, though in its condition it was unlikely to wander far. The trek to the meadow was easier than the previous day's journey, following a path Jack knew well. The snow was still deep, but here on the lower slopes of the mountain, the wind had sculpted it into drifts, leaving some areas nearly bare. Jack carried a canvas sack and a small folding shovel, tools for the task ahead. The meadow, when he reached it, was largely snow-covered, but Jack knew where to look. Near the bases of the large rocks that dotted the open space, the snow was thinner, melted away by heat the stones absorbed from the sun. Sure enough, in these protected microclimates, hardy winter grasses poked through, brown but still nutritious for a hungry horse. Jack spent 2 hours digging and cutting, harvesting every bit of accessible grass he could find. It wasn't much. His sack was only half full when he exhausted the available forage. But it was something. As he worked, his mind wandered to the horse waiting in his shed, to the improbability of their meeting, and the even greater improbability of their journey to safety. "Should give him a name," Jack muttered to himself as he cut another patch of grass. "Can't just keep calling him the horse." Names had power, though. They created connection, implied permanence. Part of Jack hesitated to take that step, to acknowledge that this animal might become more than a temporary responsibility. Mike would arrive tomorrow, and then what? The horse would need months of care to recover fully, if it recovered at all. Jack had spent 3 years cultivating solitude, building walls between himself and the world. Was he really ready to let someone, breach those defenses? On his way back to the cabin, Jack passed the stream that ran near his property, now frozen over with a thick layer of ice. He paused, breaking through the surface with his shovel to reveal the clear water flowing beneath. An idea formed as he watched the water ripple around the jagged edges of ice. He filled his canteen, then continued home with a slightly lighter step. When Jack returned to the shed, he found the horse still lying where he'd left it, though its head came up instantly at his approach. "Brought you something," Jack said, emptying the sack of winter grass onto the floor, within easy reach of the animal. The horse sniffed the offering, then began to eat with surprising delicacy, selecting each mouthful carefully. While the horse ate, Jack examined its leg again. The area around the break remained warm to the touch, but no warmer than it had been that morning. Still, infection was his greatest concern now that they had reached shelter. He recalled something his grandfather had taught him years ago, a folk remedy for horses with inflammation. Back in the cabin, Jack mixed salt into the stream water he'd collected, creating a cold brine solution. He found a clean cloth, soaked it in the mixture, then brought it to the shed. This might help with the swelling, he explained as he carefully applied the cold compress to the horse's leg. My grandfather swore by salt water for pretty much everything, said it drew out the bad and left the good. The horse tensed initially at the cold sensation, but soon relaxed as the compress began to numb the inflamed area. Jack maintained gentle pressure, speaking softly all the while. He found himself telling the horse about his grandfather's farm again, about the summers he'd spent there learning to ride, to mend fences, to respect the rhythms of rural life. Might have stayed there, Jack admitted, if things had been different. Grandfather died my senior year of high school. Farm went to my uncle, who sold it within a month. Joined the army instead. Seemed like the right thing at the time. The horse's ears flicked back and forth, tracking Jack's voice as if following the thread of his story. Its eyes, dark and intelligent, remained fixed on his face with an intensity that made Jack feel truly seen in a way he hadn't experienced in years. "Ghost," Jack said suddenly, the name coming to him unbidden. "That's what I'll call you, white as a ghost, appearing out of nowhere in that clearing like some kind of spirit." He reached out to stroke the horse's neck. "What do you think? Does ghost suit you?" The horse, Ghost, nickered softly, the sound neither acceptance nor rejection, but acknowledgement. It was enough for Jack. That night, after ensuring Ghost was comfortable with fresh water and the remainder of the foraged grass, Jack sat by his wood stove with a mug of coffee laced with the last of his whiskey. Outside, the temperature was dropping rapidly, the clear sky allowing heat to escape into the vast darkness above. Inside, the cabin was warm, the familiar space somehow changed by the knowledge that he was no longer entirely alone on this mountain. Jack's satellite phone sat on the table before him, Mike's number ready to be dialed in the morning for an update on road conditions. Beyond that, Jack hadn't allowed himself to think too far ahead. One day at a time had been his mantra since Afghanistan, a way to make the weight of existence bearable when it threatened to crush him. Now that same philosophy applied to Ghost's care. Today, they had survived. Tomorrow would bring its own challenges. For the first time in longer than he could remember, Jack found himself looking forward to the dawn. Morning brought clear skies and marginally warmer temperatures, the sun reflecting brilliantly off the snow-covered landscape surrounding Jack's cabin. After checking on Ghost, who seemed to have passed a comfortable night, Jack called Mike for an update on road conditions. "They've cleared the main road up to the junction," Mike reported, his voice breaking up slightly over the satellite connection. "I should be able to make it to your place by early afternoon if I take the four-wheel drive." "I'll be here," Jack said, relief evident in his voice despite his attempt to sound matter-of-fact. Ghost needed proper veterinary care, and while Jack had done his best, he was acutely aware of the limits of his knowledge. After ending the call, Jack spent the morning preparing for Mike's arrival. He cleared a path from the main road to his cabin, shoveling snow until his back ached and his bad leg throbbed in protest. Then he foraged for more grass in the areas around the cabin, gathering enough to keep Ghost fed for another day. It wasn't ideal nutrition for a horse of Ghost's size, but it was the best he could manage until Mike arrived with proper supplies. Around noon, Jack heard the distant sound of an engine laboring up the mountain road. He stepped onto the porch, watching as Mike's battered truck came into view, chains on the tires providing traction in the snow. The vehicle lurched to a stop beside Jack's own truck, which sat covered in snow, unused since before the storm. Mike Townsend emerged from the driver's seat, a stocky man in his 50s with a weathered face and hands that spoke of decades of hard work. He wore a heavy canvas jacket and a baseball cap pulled low over eyes that surveyed Jack's property with professional interest. "Harrison," Mike greeted him with a nod. "Been a while." "Mike," Jack returned the nod, keeping his distance. They weren't friends exactly, but they shared the unspoken bond of veterans who recognized something familiar in each other's bearing, in the way they scanned their surroundings, in the shadows that sometimes crossed their expressions. "So where's this horse you've been playing doctor to?" Mike asked, pulling a large medical kit from the truck bed. "Must be something special for you to go to all this trouble." Jack led him to the shed without responding to the implied question. Ghost was awake and alert, his white coat gleaming in the dim light filtering through the small window. When they entered, the horse's ears pricked forward, his dark eyes assessing the newcomer with evident wariness. "Well, I'll be damned," Mike said softly, setting down his kit just inside the door. "He's magnificent." Jack had to agree. Even injured and confined to the cramped quarters of the shed, Ghost radiated a wild dignity that was impossible to ignore. The horse's powerful build, his intelligent gaze, the way he held his head, everything about him spoke of freedom and strength temporarily subdued but not diminished. "Never seen anything like him in these mountains," Mike continued, approaching slowly with the practiced caution of a man who knew the dangers of startled animals. "Where'd you say you found him?" "About 5 miles west of here, in a clearing near the ridge," Jack replied, moving to Ghost's head to keep the horse calm as Mike drew nearer. "He was already down when I got there. Broken leg. Would have died if the cold didn't get him first." Mike nodded, his expression somber. "Most would have put him down on the spot, kinder that way usually." "Wasn't an option," Jack said simply, not entirely sure himself why he'd made the choice he had. It had just felt right, necessary somehow in a way he couldn't articulate. Mike seemed to understand without further explanation. He knelt beside Ghost's injured leg, his movements deliberate and gentle. "Let's have a look at what we're dealing with here." The examination was thorough, Mike's experienced hands probing the injury with a delicacy that belied his rugged appearance. Ghost remained surprisingly cooperative, though Jack could feel the tension in the horse's muscles, the occasional tremor that ran through his massive frame when Mike touched a particularly sensitive area. "You did a good job with this splint," Mike said finally, sitting back on his heels. "Clean break, thankfully. No compound fracture. That's why he's still with us, I'd wager. That and your stubbornness." "So what's the prognosis?" Jack asked, absently stroking Ghost's neck in a gesture that had already become familiar to them both. Mike sighed, removing his cap to run a hand through his thinning hair. "With proper care, he might make a full recovery. Might always have a limp. Hard to say for certain at this stage." He looked at Jack directly. "But we're talking months of recovery, not days or weeks. You prepared for that?" The question hung in the air between them, loaded with implications. Jack had built his life around solitude, around the freedom to come and go as he pleased without responsibility to anyone else. Taking on Ghost's long-term care would mean sacrificing that independence, committing to a daily routine of feeding, medication, and eventually rehabilitation. "I brought him this far," Jack said finally. "I'll see it through." Mike nodded, a hint of approval in his eyes. "Thought you might say that. All right, let's get to work." Over the next hour, Mike treated Ghost's leg with a proper medical splint, antibiotics to prevent infection, and anti-inflammatory medication to reduce the swelling. He showed Jack how to administer the injections, how to change the bandages, how to monitor for signs of complications. Through it all, Ghost remained remarkably compliant, as if understanding that these strangers were working to help him. "He's smart," Mike observed as he packed up his equipment. "Never seen a wild horse take to human handling so quickly. Usually they fight you every step of the way, especially when they're hurting." "He's different," Jack agreed, watching as Ghost drifted into a light doze, the medication beginning to take effect. Outside the shed, Mike handed Jack several large bags of feed and medications he'd brought in his truck. "This should last a couple of weeks. I'll be back to check on him before it runs out." He hesitated, then added, "There are facilities that could take him. Places with proper equipment for equine rehabilitation. Might be easier than trying to handle this yourself." Jack shook his head, not even considering the option. "He stays here." Mike studied him for a moment, then shrugged. "Your call. Just know what you're signing up for." As Mike prepared to leave, he paused by his truck, looking back at Jack with an expression that wasn't quite concern, but something adjacent to it. "This mean you're finally rejoining the land of the living, Harrison?" Jack didn't answer immediately. Was that what this was? After 3 years of self-imposed exile, was one injured horse enough to pull him back into the world? He wasn't sure, but something had shifted inside him since finding Ghost in that clearing, some frozen part of himself beginning to thaw. "Just helping a horse," he said finally, deflecting the question. Mike smiled slightly. "Right. Well, call if anything changes. I'll be back in 10 days unless I hear from you sooner." After Mike's truck disappeared down the mountain road, Jack returned to the shed. Ghost was awake again, watching him with those intelligent eyes that seemed to see too much. Jack settled beside him, checking the new splint, ensuring the horse was comfortable. "Just you and me again," Jack told him. "Hope you don't mind staying a while." Ghost nickered softly, the sound almost conversational, and Jack found himself smiling, a genuine smile that felt unfamiliar on his face after so long. Whatever lay ahead, whatever challenges Ghost's recovery might bring, Jack knew with unexpected certainty that he'd made the right choice in that snow-covered clearing days ago. Some burdens, it seemed, were worth carrying. Days stretched into weeks as winter maintained its grip on the mountains. The routine Jack established around Ghost's care became the framework that structured his days, replacing the formless existence he'd cultivated since leaving the military. Each morning began before dawn, feeding and checking Ghost's leg, administering medication, cleaning the shed. Midday brought another round of care, and evenings ended the same way, Jack often sitting with Ghost for hours as darkness fell, talking in the quiet solitude they shared. February gave way to March, bringing longer days and occasional thaws that turned the snow to slush before freezing again overnight. Ghost's recovery progressed steadily, the break healing cleanly according to Mike, who made regular visits to check on his unusual patient. "He's doing better than I expected," Mike admitted during his third visit, examining the leg with professional thoroughness. "Another couple of weeks and we can start some gentle movement therapy. Get him bearing weight on it gradually." Jack nodded, absorbing the information with the same focused attention he once gave mission briefings. Ghost's care had become his mission now, a purpose that drove him with unexpected intensity. He'd read every book on horse rehabilitation he could get his hands on, ordering them online and having them delivered to the general store in town, where the owner's raised eyebrows suggested Jack's sudden interest in equine medicine hadn't gone unnoticed. "Been thinking," Mike said as they stood outside the shed after the examination, breath fogging in the cold air. "That horse needs more space than this shed. Once he's mobile, he'll need somewhere to move around, build his strength back up." Jack had been considering the same problem. The shed had served its purpose during the emergency phase of Ghost's recovery, but it was far from ideal for long-term rehabilitation. "I've got plans," he said simply. Those plans had occupied his evenings for weeks now, sketches and calculations spread across his kitchen table as he designed a proper shelter and paddock for Ghost. The structure would extend from the existing shed, giving Ghost room to move while still providing protection from the elements. It was an ambitious project, especially for one man working alone, but Jack approached it with the same methodical determination that had characterized his military career. The day after Mike's visit, Jack began construction. The sound of his chainsaw echoed through the valley as he felled selected trees, trimming and cutting them to serve as posts and rails. Each evening, exhausted but satisfied, he would explain the day's progress to Ghost, who listened with pricked ears as if understanding every word. "Framework's nearly done," Jack reported one night, settling onto the straw beside Ghost with a groan of tired muscles. "Another week, maybe less, and you'll have a proper place to stay. Room to move around a bit, too." Ghost nickered softly, nudging Jack's shoulder with his muzzle, in what had become a familiar gesture of companionship. The horse's personality had emerged more fully during his convalescence, intelligent, dignified, with an unexpected gentleness that belied his powerful build. He seemed to appreciate the quiet, much as Jack did, but also welcomed conversation, responding with small sounds and movements that sometimes felt uncannily like replies. "Never thought I'd end up building a horse barn," Jack admitted, absently stroking Ghost's neck. "Then again, never thought I'd end up living like a hermit on a mountain either." The admission hung in the air, an unexpected moment of self-awareness. Jack hadn't spoken of his isolation as a choice before, had never framed it as the deliberate withdrawal it was. In the military, he'd been surrounded by people, his unit, his team, a brotherhood forged in shared purpose and danger. After the explosion that had taken his men and left him with both visible and invisible scars, that connection had become unbearable, a constant reminder of what he'd lost and what he perceived as his failure. "They sent me to therapists," Jack found himself saying, the words coming easier in the darkness with only Ghost to hear them. "Wanted me to talk about it, process it, move on." He laughed, a short, humorless sound. "How do you move on from watching your friends die, from knowing it should have been you instead?" Ghost shifted, resting his head against Jack's leg with a weight that was somehow comforting rather than burdensome. "Tried medication for a while, made everything foggy, couldn't think straight, couldn't feel anything at all. That was worse somehow." Jack's hand continued its rhythmic stroking of Ghost's neck, the repetitive motion soothing them both. "So I came up here. Figured if I couldn't fix what was broken, at least I could put it somewhere it wouldn't hurt anyone else." The confession left Jack feeling strangely lighter, as if speaking the words aloud had diminished their power over him. Ghost remained still beside him, a solid presence that asked nothing, judged nothing, simply existed alongside him in comfortable silence. Work on the expanded shelter continued through the following week, Jack pushing himself harder each day. The physical labor was therapeutic in its way, muscles burning with clean, honest exertion that left little energy for dwelling on the past. By the time Mike returned for his next visit, the new structure was nearly complete. A covered paddock extending from the original shed with sturdy walls that would block the wind while allowing Ghost room to move around. "Impressive," Mike commented, surveying the construction with a critical eye. "You do this all yourself?" Jack nodded, feeling an unexpected flash of pride at the simple praise. Figured he deserved better than a tool shed. Mike's expression softened slightly. "Ready to try getting him on his feet more regularly? The legs healed enough for short periods of standing, which will help prevent muscle atrophy." The process of helping Ghost stand and take his first tentative steps in over a month was painstaking. The horse was understandably cautious, testing the injured leg gingerly, while Jack supported his weight as much as possible. They moved from the shed to the newly constructed paddock at a glacial pace, each step carefully considered. "That's it," Jack encouraged, one arm wrapped around Ghost's powerful neck, the other supporting his shoulder. "Nice and easy." Ghost snorted, muscles trembling with effort and perhaps fear, but he continued forward, trusting Jack's guidance implicitly. When they finally reached the paddock, Ghost stood for a long moment, seeming to appreciate the additional space and light after weeks confined to the shed. He turned his head to look at Jack, dark eyes meeting human ones in a moment of shared accomplishment. "Told you we'd get here," Jack said softly, allowing himself a rare smile. That night, with Ghost settled in his new quarters, Jack sat on his cabin porch watching stars emerge in the clear mountain sky. The bitter cold of deep winter was giving way to the merely chilly temperatures of early spring, a transition that felt appropriate to his own state of mind. Nothing dramatic, no sudden thaw, but a gradual shifting toward something less frozen, less isolated. He thought of Ghost, of the long road to recovery still ahead, and found he wasn't daunted by the prospect. One day at a time had been his mantra of survival for 3 years. Now somehow it felt more like a promise than a burden. April arrived with surprising gentleness, bringing rain instead of snow and coaxing the first tentative green shoots from the earth. The mountains seemed to exhale as winter's grip loosened, streams swelling with snowmelt, birds returning to fill the mornings with song. For Jack, the changing season mirrored Ghost's progress, gradual but undeniable, each day bringing small victories worth celebrating. Ghost was standing more regularly now, able to bear weight on his injured leg for increasing periods. The splint had been replaced with a lighter brace that allowed for limited mobility while still providing support. Under Jack's watchful eye, the horse took daily walks around the paddock, each circuit a little stronger than the last. Mike, on his bi-weekly visits, expressed continued amazement at Ghost's recovery. "Never seen anything like it," he admitted during his latest checkup, watching Ghost move across the paddock with only a slight hitch in his gait. "Most horses with breaks this severe never walk normally again if they survive at all." Jack nodded, his eyes following Ghost's movements with the careful assessment that had become second nature. He knew every nuance of the horse's behavior now, the way Ghost's ears would flatten slightly when he was in pain but trying to hide it, the particular nickering sound he made when he wanted attention, the subtle shifts in his stance that indicated fatigue. "He's tough," Jack said simply, though pride colored his voice despite his attempt at nonchalance. Mike glanced at him with a knowing look. "So are you. Most people would have given up weeks ago. Hell, most people wouldn't have started in the first place." Jack shrugged off the compliment, uncomfortable with praise he didn't feel he deserved. What he'd done for Ghost didn't feel like heroism to him, just the only choice he could have lived with. Still, he couldn't deny that the weeks of caring for the horse had changed something fundamental within him. The fog that had surrounded him since Afghanistan had thinned, allowing moments of clarity and even occasional peace. "I've been thinking," Mike said as they watched Ghost complete another circuit of the paddock, "that leg's never going to be 100%. He'll always have limitations." He paused, studying Jack's reaction. "But that doesn't mean he can't have a good life, just means adjusting expectations." Jack understood what Mike wasn't saying directly, that Ghost could never return to the wild, not with a leg that would always be vulnerable to re-injury. The horse that had once roamed these mountains freely would need human care for the rest of his life. The realization wasn't new. Jack had been coming to terms with it gradually over the weeks of Ghost's recovery. Still, hearing it spoken aloud made it more concrete, more final. "He stays with me," Jack said, the decision already made long before this moment. "For as long as he needs to." Mike nodded, seeming unsurprised. "Thought you might say that. Going to mean some changes around here, though. Proper stable for winter, fenced grazing area, regular vet visits." He eyed Jack speculatively. "Might even need to drive into town occasionally for supplies, interact with actual people." The thought would have filled Jack with dread a few months ago. Now it was merely a practical consideration, a necessary adjustment to accommodate Ghost's needs. "I'll manage," he said dryly. Later that evening, after Mike had departed with promises to return in 2 weeks, Jack sat in the paddock beside Ghost, both of them enjoying the relative warmth of the spring evening. The horse was resting, his injured legs stretched out carefully before him, his massive head lowered to Jack's shoulder in what had become a familiar gesture of trust and affection. "Mike thinks you're staying for good," Jack told him, absently stroking the white mane that had grown longer during Ghost's convalescence. "Says you can't go back to the wild. Leg won't hold up." He sighed, looking out over the valley below, where the last rays of sunlight gilded the tops of the pines. "Guess that makes two of us. Too broken for our old lives, stuck figuring out what comes next." Ghost shifted, pressing his weight more firmly against Jack's side as if in disagreement with the assessment. Jack smiled slightly at the response. "You think I'm wrong? Maybe you're right. Maybe broken isn't the word for it. Changed, maybe." The concept resonated in a way Jack hadn't expected. Changed, not broken. Different, but not necessarily diminished. He thought of his men, of Washington dying in the helicopter, of the guilt he'd carried like a physical weight for 3 years. Nothing could undo what had happened. Nothing could bring them back or erase the scars, both visible and invisible, that remained. But perhaps there was a way forward that honored their memory without being consumed by it. "I've been hiding," Jack admitted, speaking the truth aloud for the first time. "Thought I was protecting others from what I'd become, but really, I was just afraid. Easier to be alone than to face it all." He glanced at Ghost, whose dark eyes regarded him with what Jack could only describe as understanding. "Then you showed up and didn't give me the luxury of isolation anymore." The irony wasn't lost on him, that it had taken a wild creature, itself injured and vulnerable, to begin healing wounds that professionals and medication had failed to touch. There was something about the uncomplicated nature of Ghost's needs, the pure focus required to keep him alive and help him recover, that had bypassed Jack's defenses and reached something essential within him. As spring progressed, Ghost continued to improve, graduating from short walks in the paddock to longer excursions around the property. Jack remained constantly at his side, ready to support the horse if his strength faltered, though such interventions became increasingly rare. Ghost's natural athleticism reasserted itself, his movements regaining much of their former grace despite the permanent stiffness in his injured leg. One clear morning in late April, Jack decided it was time to test Ghost's progress more thoroughly. Instead of their usual circuit around the cabin and nearby clearing, he led the horse toward a gentle slope that offered a view of the valley below. Ghost followed willingly, his trust in Jack now absolute, his powerful body moving with growing confidence beside the man who had saved him. They reached the overlook just as the sun fully cleared the eastern mountains, casting long shadows across the valley and illuminating the peaks to the west with golden light. Jack stood silent, appreciating the familiar vista with fresh eyes. Beside him, Ghost raised his head, nostrils flaring as he caught the scents carried on the morning breeze. Pine, earth, the distant smell of water from the stream that wound through the valley floor. "Not a bad view," Jack said quietly. "Worth fighting to see it again, I think." Ghost nickered softly in what sounded remarkably like agreement, his ears pricked forward as he surveyed the landscape below. In that moment, man and horse stood together on the mountainside, both scarred, both changed, but both alive to witness another day's beginning. Jack couldn't help but wonder how different this same view would have looked if he'd passed by that clearing months ago without stopping, if he'd made the rational choice to end Ghost's suffering quickly rather than embarking on the improbable journey that had brought them here. How different would he himself be if he hadn't found something outside himself worth fighting for? Summer came to the mountains in a riot of wildflowers and birdsong, transforming the landscape Jack had known only in winter and early spring. The meadows exploded with color, providing Ghost with ample grazing as his strength continued to return. Jack expanded the paddock, creating a larger fenced area where the horse could move freely without risking a fall on uneven terrain. Though Ghost still favored his injured leg, he had adapted remarkably, compensating with subtle shifts in his gait that allowed him to move with surprising grace. On a warm July morning, Jack sat on the cabin porch, coffee in hand, watching Ghost graze in the early light. The horse's white coat gleamed in the sun, his muscular body showing little sign of the ordeal that had nearly claimed his life 6 months earlier. 6 months that had changed everything. Jack's isolation had gradually eased, necessity forcing him to venture into town more frequently for supplies. At first, these trips had been exercises in endurance, Jack speaking only when absolutely necessary, avoiding eye contact, completing his business as quickly as possible before retreating to the safety of his mountain. But over time, something shifted. The storekeeper, Ellen, began setting aside special items she thought might be useful for Ghost. The local feed supplier, an older man named Henry, who had worked with horses all his life, offered advice and occasionally accompanied Mike on his visits to check on Ghost's progress. Small interactions, insignificant to most people, but for Jack, they represented bridges to a world he had deliberately cut himself off from for 3 years. He wasn't suddenly sociable. The awkwardness, the hypervigilance, the moments when the past crowded too close remained. But there was a difference. He was present in a way he hadn't been before, anchored by the responsibility he had assumed for another living being. "What do you think, Ghost?" Jack called, watching as the horse lifted his head at the sound of his name. "Should we try going a little further today?" Their walks had become a daily ritual, gradually increasing in distance as Ghost's strength returned. They had explored much of the area immediately surrounding the cabin, but Jack had been cautious about venturing too far, concerned about overtaxing Ghost's still healing leg. Today, though, the weather was perfect, and Ghost had been particularly energetic all week. After breakfast, Jack saddled up, not to ride, as Ghost's back would likely never bear weight again, but to carry supplies for their journey. The saddle was one of several items Jack had purchased in town, along with proper grooming tools, nutritional supplements, and the specialized feed Mike had recommended. What had begun as emergency care had evolved into something more permanent, more intentional. They set out mid-morning, Jack walking beside Ghost along a trail that led deeper into the mountains. The horse moved steadily, his muscular body radiating health despite the slight hitch in his step. Occasionally, Ghost would pause to investigate something interesting, a patch of particularly lush grass, a flowering bush, a startled rabbit darting across their path. But he always returned to Jack's side, as if unwilling to stray too far from his companion. "You could run, you know," Jack told him during one such pause, watching as Ghost sniffed curiously at a clump of wildflowers. "You're strong enough now. You could just take off." The words were casual, but something tightened in Jack's chest at the thought. Ghost merely looked at him, dark eyes seeming to convey something beyond words, then deliberately returned to Jack's side, bumping his shoulder gently with his muzzle. By early afternoon, they had reached their destination, a small plateau overlooking the valley, different from their usual viewpoint but offering an even more spectacular vista. Jack removed Ghost's saddle, allowing the horse to graze while he unpacked their supplies. He had brought lunch for himself and a treat of apples for Ghost, a luxury the horse had developed a particular fondness for during his recovery. Sitting on a sun-warmed rock, Jack surveyed the landscape below. From this height, he could see the ribbon of road that led to town, tiny vehicles occasionally visible as they navigated the mountain passes. Beyond lay the broader valley, patches of forest interspersed with clearings, and the silver thread of a river winding its way toward the horizon. It was beautiful, alive, a world continuing on its course regardless of the dramas that played out within it. "Mike says you're as recovered as you're ever going to be," Jack told Ghost, who had finished grazing and now stood nearby, head raised to catch the mountain breeze. "Says we've achieved what vets call maximum medical improvement. Fancy way of saying this is as good as it gets." Ghost's ears flicked at the sound of Jack's voice, his attention focused entirely on the man who had saved him. "Could be worse," Jack continued, reaching out to stroke Ghost's neck. "We both made it further than anyone expected." The words carried more meaning than Jack had intended, an acknowledgement of his own journey as much as Ghost's. 6 months ago, he had been surviving rather than living, going through the motions of existence without purpose or connection. Finding Ghost had changed that trajectory, had given him something outside himself to focus on, had forced him to engage with the world rather than withdraw from it. It wasn't a miracle cure. Jack still had nightmares. He still struggled with crowds and loud noises. He still carried the weight of what had happened in Afghanistan, the loss of his men, the questions about his decisions that day. But alongside those burdens now existed something else, a sense of purpose, a daily reason to push forward, to remain present, to do more than simply endure. Ghost had given him that, had pulled him back from the brink of surrender with a simple, uncompromising need for care. And in return, Jack had given Ghost a second chance at life, different from what the horse had known before, but valuable in its own way. "We should head back," Jack said eventually, gathering their supplies as the afternoon began to wane. Still a long walk home. Home. The word settled in Jack's mind with unexpected weight. For 3 years, the cabin had been a refuge, a hiding place, a self-imposed exile. Now, somehow, it had become home, a place of purpose, and even occasionally, contentment. They began the journey back as the sun started its descent toward the western peaks, casting long shadows across the trail. Ghost moved easily beside Jack, their pace matched through long practice, their footfalls creating a rhythm that spoke of companionship rather than solitude. That evening, with Ghost settled in his stable for the night, Jack sat on his porch watching stars appear in the darkening sky. He thought of the clearing where he had found Ghost 6 months earlier, of the choice he had made to help rather than end suffering, of the long journey that had followed. He thought of his men, of Washington's final moments, of the guilt he had carried like stones in his pockets, weighing him down with every step. The guilt hadn't vanished. Jack doubted it ever would, but it had changed, transformed from a crushing weight into something he could carry while still moving forward. One day at a time had become one step at a time, a journey rather than an endurance test. In the stable, Ghost nickered softly, the sound carrying through the quiet evening. Jack smiled, a genuine expression that no longer felt foreign on his face. "Yeah," he said quietly, as if the horse could hear him. "I'm still here too." And in that moment it was enough. 2 souls who had found each other in the wilderness, each broken in their own way, each healing through the simple, profound gift of connection. Not a fairy tale ending, but something better. A real one, earned through pain and perseverance, imperfect but honest. One day at a time, one step at a time, together.